the only thing that counts is, are we elevating the poor and the middle class?
Morning, good afternoon, good evening to our listeners all around the world. This is Sid, your host of Sit Down with Sid podcast. We are back for season 4 with a bang, with a special guest, Michael Sall, the undisputed king of gin rummy player in New York City since the 1980s. A very popular and public figure out here. Michael, thank you so much for taking the time to be on our podcast today.
Thanks for having me.
Perfect, perfect. Michael, so for the first time listeners who don't know you yet, would you take a couple of minutes just to give a little bit background about yourself to our audience before we kind of dive into the podcast subjects?
Uh, well, I I got my first education in the pool room. I made my living when I was 15 through 18 there. I went into the Army because Vietnam was going on. I would have been drafted, so I signed up. And that was my second major educational experience. It turned me away from the criminal activities that I was engaged in, that I was surrounded by in the pool room. Next came college, which was beneficial, but only modestly so. I then joined a club with most of the wealthy, self-made, successful men in the Philadelphia area belonging. It was an all-men's golf club, and gambled there, making lots and lots of money, but more importantly, befriending these guys and getting an education in business and from people who really did it, not academics who watched it, but the ones that were there in the pits doing it. And they were much older than me, and they liked to talk about it. Uh, so, unbeknownst to me, I thought I was making plenty of money, but really, what I learned was infinitely more valuable. And then I used that knowledge and information to begin lending money, then uh, um, investing in equity. All the while, I continued gambling, but like I like to say, that the gambling went from 100% of my income when I was 27 or 30 years old to 1% of my income by the time I was 50 or 60 years old.
Wow.
I just learned business, and what I learned from these guys gave me the confidence to really take plunges where I think maybe, others might have been fearful, but and that's really pretty much it. That's where I am today. I gamble, I enjoy it, but I enjoy business more, and that's what I'm active in.
So, Michael, let me ask you, when did you find the love of gambling? Like, when did you realize I'm so good at it, or I'm good at it where I can make 100% of my income just from gambling as a career, as a hobby, as a profession, whatever word you want to call
Well, I was hanging around the pool room before I moved out of my parents' house. I moved out when I was 15, and I could see that I could win money there. Now, mind you, it's sort of a minimum wage job, but I knew that. And when I moved out of my parents' house at 15, I was fully confident and proved true that I could hustle enough money to pay my bills. Even when I was in college, I did a few different things, but it was just easy for me to make money.
it.
Then, when I was armed with the knowledge that I gained at the club, with the golf club where I had joined when I was 26, uh, that made it all just that much easier. Now I had that pool room hustle combined with very, just a good perspective on how these things work. And I pursue it, Sid, for as much intellectual curiosity as anything else. That's why I developed my ideas on inflation, income inequality, and the different things that I suppose we're going to talk about.
Yes, definitely. So, the first topic I want to talk about is capitalism. As we all know, United States is the greatest capitalist country in the world. Now, most people agree that capitalism has lifted billions out of poverty, but it is also blamed for inequality and wealth gap in this society. So, I want to know, where do you think the critique of capitalism has gone wrong or gets it right?
Well, I think generally speaking, it's dead wrong. It couldn't be more wrong. If you start out historically, if you look around the world and you see every attempt at modifying capitalism, you see a decline in wealth production, not just for the rich, but for the very poor. The and I'll get to this in a minute, but the widening wealth gap in America is should be, I believe, totally ignored. The only thing that counts is, are we elevating the poor and the middle class? If expanding the wealth gap is a function of elevating them faster and further, then I'm all for it. And it's hard to imagine who wouldn't be. But uh, if you limit your vision to just the increasing wealth gap, then I suppose you could lodge all manner of complaints. But if you expand it to include, okay, what effect does that have on the poor and the middle class? You might withdraw them. If you look around the world, it's funny because it's almost as if the left in America wants to keep the populace in ignorance. I could list you just off the top of my head, 10 countries, 20 countries that either moved towards capitalism and exploded the benefits for their lower and middle class, or who moved away from capitalism and destroyed what was the level for their poor and middle class. I mean, Chile moved towards capitalism. They went from the poorest to the wealthiest nation in South America. Argentina, which had a standard of living equal to France, when they adopted socialism, they took that and they became one of the poorer nations in South America. The Soviet Union and Mao Zedong and China speak for themselves. What do you think reversed China's economic success? When Mao died, uh, Dao, I forgot his name, decided that making money was good, and they employed a capitalist system. Long term, given the state involvement and whatnot, we can argue whether it will survive, they will continue to grow. But in the short term, it's obvious that it brought more, literally hundreds of millions of people out of poverty.
So, Michael,
Capitalism's
right.
anyone who knows history, there's virtually no denying its success. Could there be another system? I don't know. I'm not smart enough, but I do know that heretofore there's never been anything even close.
So, Michael, I do agree on some of the points when it comes to providing more resources to the middle and the poor class of a society. in a capitalist nation. But my pushback to you is if capitalism is so great, then why does every single capitalist country, including Chile, as you mentioned, end up bailing out the rich, the top 0.001%, with trillions when their bets go bad? And I'm going to give you an example is the 2008 global financial crisis when Lehman Brothers crashed. What did the US do? It helped the banks, you know. So why do you think it is run that way?
Well, I won't pretend to know the exact form of capitalism that is optimal. And what you say is true, but for me, that's not the measure that should be used in judging it. The government bailing these companies out, I would argue, occurred in part because they weren't capitalistic enough. But that's only theoretical. I make no claim to being able to prove it. All right. But what I would point out is that the government, well, Sid, I think I can best explain it this way. I've written a paper where I outline why income inequality is both a necessary and a desirable element in order to grow the poor and middle class. And a very abbreviated version goes like this. My premise is the government, and we, the people in the United States, are the government. The government owns every business. It's no different than communism or where they directly own the means of production. In the United States, and my support for that premise is that in the US, the government has unlimited taxing authority. I mean, realize a government by definition is the unappealable final decider for everything. So in the United States, they can tax you as much as they want. We actually had 93% taxes, income taxes in the 50s. They can regulate you out of existence. They can pass laws requiring that you hire a certain percentage women. See the laws on the books now that where they're requiring corporations to have a certain percentage of women on their boards. The government can basically do anything they want. And for those who would argue that the Constitution is a protector there, I would say that, first of all, that it has and can easily be gotten around. But in addition, given emergency powers, all the government has to do is declare an emergency, and the Constitution becomes irrelevant. Roosevelt did it during the Second World War. He interned Japanese. Lincoln suspended the right of habeas corpus. So start with the premise the government ultimately owns everything. So who are these people we call the titular heads of corporations? They are people that we, the government, we, the people, hire to do production. I can't do orthopedic surgery, so I hire people to do it. And it is the ultimate test of the merit system because those people, should they fail, they have no money to work with. And should they succeed, we give them more money to work with to produce more wealth. All right, premise number two. A wealthy person can only do three things with their money. They can consume it, spend it on their own wants. They can give it away, or they can invest it. Now, most people would agree that giving it away is fine, and we will call that'll be a topic for another day. So let's ignore that. The wealthy in America could not consume a meaningful percentage of their wealth if they made it their life's work. They couldn't consume 1%. When someone has 3, 5, $100 billion, consumption of their wealth is insignificant. So apart from charity, the only other thing they can do with their money is invested. Now, what's an investment? An investment is an attempt to create wealth. It's an attempt to find something wanted or needed by society and fill that need. To the extent they're successful, they will increase their money. So what's happening? We, the people, their bosses, say, okay, you did a good job there. I'm going to give you more money to see if you can do, the same thing in other areas and expand it. So premise number 2 is that by far the dominant force in people's wealth is investment, not consumption. Premise number 3 would be that wealth creation, which is what we're doing, and I want to divert for a minute, just to explain. If you play poker, it's a zero-sum game. For every dollar someone wins, there's someone there who loses a dollar. But when you invest money, it's very different. If you invest money, you create wealth that did not exist prior to your investment. Hopefully, you create more wealth than the dollars you invested, thereby showing a profit. That's what wealth create. That's the proof of wealth creation. So, but you have to appreciate that it gets created from nothing. It gets created from investment, hard work, ingenuity, imagination, all those things. So my next premise is that wealth creation benefits not only the creator, but the public at large. Now, Microsoft, I'd like to use as an example, obviously made billions for its founders. It made billions for its shareholders. It made billions for its employees. Okay? I want to ask you a question. Do you think the wealth created for those groups was greater or less than the wealth that was created for the public at large using their products? I would argue that what they created for themselves was minuscule compared to what they did for everyone else.
I agree.
And that is the nature that, look, you buy an automobile, it's $50,000. Do you think you could create that vehicle for $5 million? For $50 million? You couldn't. So when you're buying it for $50,000, you are a beneficiary of that company's production. Now, the company's employees are making money, their shareholders are making money, their suppliers are making money, but you are also a huge beneficiary of that transaction. My point being that as we, the owners of the corporations, as these employees of ours who we call owners, the more they succeed, the more we succeed, the greater the benefit to us. And the difference between us and communism is that we allow these people the freedoms to make the decisions on how to invest, where to invest, how much to invest. Whereas there's a belief among communists that central planning will best do that job. The reality is time has exposed the ridiculousness of the communist viewpoint. They can't do it better. So my argument is I really don't care how rich the rich get. I care how the middle class and poor quintiles do. And they are well served by the expanding wealth gap.
Very well put together, Michael. Uh, so based on that, I want to share a couple of stats with you on the economic inequality, which is the income inequality disparity between the rich and the poor. So as of now, the U.S. wealth inequality at its highest level since the 1920s. As you know, the top 0.1% holds about 20 to 25% of U.S. wealth, which is equal to the bottom 90% combined. And one of the stats which I found very fascinating was the CEO to worker pay ratio averaged 320 to 1 in 2023. It used to be 21 to 1 in 1965 and 60 to 1 in 1989. So it has multiplied 5 times, 6 times in the last uh, 3 decades. Why is that? I mean, we are talking about how good capitalism is, but this is actually a consequence. What I'm sharing with you, these numbers, this is the direct consequence of a capitalist nation as well. In my opinion, I could be wrong.
Well, you know, as an analogy, I'd say those statistics are looking at the speed of the baseball, not whether it's a pop out or a home run. The speed doesn't matter. If it gets out of the park, it's a success. And if it's in a defender's glove, it's a failure. You're looking, I believe, at the wrong thing. Those statistics are a consequence of what should be looked at, which is what has that process during these 30 years that you named, how has that process affected the poor and the middle class? Well, let's look at it. Life expectancy's gone up until COVID. That changed it a little, but allowing for an exception there. It's gone up 6 months every year for the last 50 years, more. Okay? Somebody who's collecting a family of four today with health insurance, an automobile, a home, and so forth, live better than the Rockefellers lived at the turn of the 20th century, at the end of the 18th, I'm sorry, the end of the 19th century. Okay? Given, the improvement in health, transportation, both airplanes, automobiles. So that's what I look at. And you can claim that anything's a flaw. But my viewpoint is that's a part of the system. Look, imagine this. One benefit of these expanding pools of wealth, both corporately and individually. One major benefit is that projects that have risk attached to them would never get tried or embarked on unless the people funding it or corporations funding it could afford the loss. Everyone looks at the downside. There's no certainties. When you invest money, you may be right and you may be wrong, okay? And you have to be prepared to be wrong. Well, the bigger the pool of wealth, the greater the size of the project that you can afford to take a risk on. So traveling to space, I mean, I could tell you stories. Building the Erie Canal, which was the governor of New York recognized connecting the Great Lakes with New York City would be a phenomenal boom to economic activity. Imagine that. You have the stockyards and everything in the Midwest. Shipping back and forth would be priceless. So but the legislature of New York State would not fund it. So he went to Wall Street. He got the bankers and he said, if you fund it, you can keep all the profits from it and I'll get you the right of ways needed to build it. At the time, and I forgot if it was 20 or 30 or more, but it was an order of magnitude bigger than any engineering project ever conceived of or attempted. Okay? Not only did Wall Street bring it in on time, under budget, but true to the vision of the governor of New York and their vision, the commerce between the Midwest and the East Coast skyrocketed. Well, you couldn't do that if you didn't have massive pools of money. Did they know it would succeed? Of course not. They believed it would. And my point is that's only one of many. But Sid, the important thing is this. I don't proclaim that I know all the dynamics of capitalism and why this works and why that element's necessary. But I do know that this expanding wealth gap has always been a part of successful capitalist systems. And I do know that the successful capitalist systems have always elevated the poor and middle class more than any other system on earth. So to my way of thinking, until someone comes up with something better, that's the way to go.
Okay. Uh, so I think then, in my opinion, what contradicts your statement here is I think it's the inflation part that we want to talk about, because inflation is what is killing the middle class. And it is, as I said, it is shrinking the middle class and it is making America a two-tier economy, you know. Let's talk about inflation. Three things that are important for every human being is food, income, and shelter, which is the housing. Okay. Now, before we got on camera, we were talking off camera about inflation. So, what do you think is a biggest contributor to inflation right now that we are seeing over the last 5 years since the COVID pandemic? In my knowledge, I think it is the free pumping of over $2 trillion that was dumped in the system that created all this inflation, definitely. But I would love to hear your thoughts on this. What do you think is contributing to this insane inflation and the shrinking of the middle class?
Well, inflation, the theories on inflation throughout history have been varied. I would argue some of them bizarre. Inflation in Germany at one time they thought was occurring because they did not have enough, they hadn't printed enough money. I mean, to me, it's unimaginable how they could have believed that, but that was the prevailing idea. I know that I don't know the dynamics, but as an opinion, the one overwhelming force is printing money that causes inflation. I mean, just imagine if you have a system with $1 million in it, and all of a sudden you helicopter in another million. So now the system has 2 million. What's that going to do to prices? Well, it's going to elevate them, of course. The nominal value of the currency is going to be cut in half. But these things don't happen. Print money today, inflate tomorrow. There's undoubtedly a host of forces working on it, which I certainly can't quantify, even if some of them I can identify. And their inner workings is beyond my pay grade. But the overwhelming force, they call people like me monetarists. We believe that that's it. The US government, amazingly, in 2008, they printed a lot of money in order to bail out the banks and whatnot. Okay, fair enough. You want to argue it was an emergency. I don't want to argue in favor or against it, but they did. But once things stabilized, you would think they would have withdrawn that printing, but they didn't. They continued to print money. Now, the government claims it doesn't print money, but really it does. What they do is the Federal Reserve will buy government debt and pay for it with new money they create. So they show a debit on their balance sheet. So if they buy $1 million worth of bonds, they just create the $1 million, pay it to the seller of the bond. They take the bond in and they show on their balance sheet, okay, they're $1 million the worse off because they did that. But it's only a number they're carrying forward. In the real economy, there's an extra $1 million. And that has a tendency to push prices up. The funny thing is that although, I mean, oftentimes the administration that gets blamed for it is not necessarily the culprit. Jimmy Carter got blamed for the unbelievable inflation
He had the
in the
worst
late
inflation,
70s,
yes.
but really Nixon was at fault. Nixon had wage and price controls, which is a secondary reason for inflation. In other words, he was limiting what producers could sell prices for or sell goods for. Well, what happens is that creates shortages because if I can't produce it and make a profit, I'm not going to produce it. It produces all kinds of dislocation. And then Carter suffered for it because it doesn't show itself that day. It takes a while. The same with Biden. His supposed laughably named Inflation Reduction Act was itself inflationary. But I would argue that that he was suffering from a Fed policy which kept interest rates at 1%. They wouldn't have been that cheap were it not for the Fed going into the open market and buying. So that kept a lid on interest rates. Well, I believe a great deal of the Biden inflation, some of it was caused by his own malfeasance, but a great deal was caused by the Fed's malfeasance. And look, inflation is a tax on anyone who has wealth. All right.
Well, it acts
Uh,
as a hidden tax on the poor, primarily, yes.
it especially hurts the poor because inflation of prices is always going to front run the inflation of wages. Think of it this way. When oil prices go up, the next day your gasoline prices go up, even if the
Correct.
refineries haven't yet produced the higher priced gas. Okay? But when they come down, there's always a lag. I mean, that's what capitalism is. The vendor is reluctant to sell it for less if he can get away with it. So, my point is that the same applies with wages and costs. When costs go up, they go up a lot quicker than
The
wages.
wages.
Now,
Yeah.
wages eventually will catch up. You know, ultimately, wages have put the worker ahead year by year, but let's say not nearly so far ahead as if we didn't have inflation. Inflation, and the unfortunate thing is that it's all driven the printing of money. You know, granted, they printed a lot during the pandemic, they printed a lot during the 2008 crisis, but printing occurs beyond that just by government malfeasance. Government wants to spend money. The effect of that spending, they're a lot less interested in than the political benefits that accrue. So their insatiable lust to spend means, well, if we can borrow, we will. And if we can print money, we will. And that results in the workers, people earning a salary, getting hurt. Look, in a way, you could almost blame them, say, you elected these officials that are doing it. They're the ones hurting you. Do you know China has about 10 or 20% of the welfare programs the United States does, a communist country? Do you know their taxes are only 25% of Chinese pay income taxes, and their overall tax structure is a fraction of what ours is? They have a pretty hefty consumption tax, which is like a sales tax or a VAT value added tax. But their business and they have a policy where local governments who are doing modest taxing use that money to assist local businesses. So even a good part of the money that they're taxing is being used to promote wealth creation. You can call it business or you can call it wealth creation. They're one and the same.
Yeah, but Michael, if nothing is done faster, I mean, the Fed ha runs its own policy. Does not it does is not related to the administration. It was the case in Biden. It's the case in Trump administration. They have their own ways of doing things. And but my question is, something has to be done, and I don't know what it is, or the middle class uh, will be wiped out. I mean. Uh, it's I mean, as you said, the wages have stagnated. They go up in increments, but not to the way the cost of living, which is the food, the rent. I mean, look at housing. I want to talk about housing. It is beyond control. Look at the rents. It is beyond control. So how do you tackle that? I mean, if people cannot afford to buy a house, people do have the down payment, but they can't afford to buy a house because mortgage interest rates went from 2.25% in 2021 to at the peak of 8% last year, October of 2024. Your monthly payment goes up by 12 to $1,400. So this is creating a bubble, and everyone is predicting a housing crash, just like the financial crisis of 2008. Because at some point of time, things will break down. You know, there are more buyers now, sorry, there are more sellers now in the market than the buyers. I'm in the real estate business. There were more buyers in the market than sellers, which was creating bidding wars. Things have changed, and now it's turning around a little bit because the mortgage rates have come down to below 6% again. But still, the cost of inflation, like, what do you think should be done or can be done to save the middle class? That's my major concern because it is the middle class that makes the, as you said, we the people. It's the middle and the poor class, which are the top people like who elect officials in the constitution, in the government. So what can United States or what monetary policy do you think the US should come up with to benefit this class?
Well, first of all, to understand the problem, any problem, you have to understand history. When you're talking about macroeconomic ideas, which housing is, you're never going to do the equivalent of solving a mathematical problem. There's no exact. We can theorize. We can sort of look at the forces affecting it, but and hopefully do things to assist the positive ones. But you can only do that if you understand history. Now, for example, the interest rates that we automatically assume is what's stifling housing. Well, maybe. And I say that because the interest rates in the 90s were 6, 7% or more. I mean, we had the inflationary spiral during the late 70s, the first couple of years of the 80s, and from there it declined. But even when you got to the 90s, you were paying 6% or more than 6%. And by the way, prior to the interest rate spiral in the 70s, you were paying 5% for mortgages. So it wasn't, what we're seeing now is not nearly so extreme as it appears, having recently had 2 and 3% mortgages. It looks extreme, but if you look at the broader picture, it's not so extreme. And I believe that crisis was in part caused by people who took, if you can, people who buy homes look at their monthly payment, and it's not unreasonable. Okay, so if you're paying 2% interest on your mortgage, okay, you say you can afford a $700,000 home. If you were paying 4% on your mortgage, you might only say, I can only afford a $500,000 home. And so we loaded up with homes on these cheap mortgages. And now that rates have gone up, the home is worth less. But worse, people know not only do they have to sell it for less, but the home they're going to move into, they've got to pay 6, 7% for. So for them, it says, well, maybe I'm better off not selling. Or I'll ask a ridiculous price. If I get it, I'll sell. But if not, I'm staying put. So that put a real damper on the industry. It will recover, but it always takes time for the sins of the government, the sins of excess, to work themselves out of the system. It doesn't happen overnight. And there will be an equilibrium between sellers and buyers, interest rates and what people can pay. But the mistakes of the past, I would argue easy money, created an inflated market. So now we're suffering from that sickness.
Okay, so Michael, I want to ask a couple of things before we wrap this up is on your outlook. So, do you think is the current high inflation era over, or do you think we are entering a higher inflation regime in the coming years?
Well, we're very fortunate, and this is a whole other concept, but productivity, which is research, development, new ideas, more efficient machinery, plannings, chips, allows production to be done more efficiently and cheaper. That has suppresses prices. That has a deflationary effect. And the productivity over the last 25 years has skyrocketed beyond my imagination. I don't think we can even measure it. It's so great today. And so when we look at inflation, we're looking at the increase in prices, but we're also looking at the savings created by productivity. I mean, I wrote a paper where I point out that if the government takes a basket of goods and they measure them year by year, and if prices go up 3%, they say we have 3% inflation. I argue that that's what I call nominal inflation, but real inflation is 3% plus whatever productivity gains we made that year. So had the government, had the monetary policy not caused the effect that it did, we might have had prices go down 3 or 4%. In which case, so the total real inflation is the term I apply to it, is 7% if productivity would have reduced them by 4%. Now, the measure of productivity and its effect on prices, no one has come up with a formula yet. Certainly, I don't know it. But I do know that it's real. I do know it does have a depressing effect, and to some degree, absent monetary policy, prices would come down in today's environment and come down at an astounding rate, because what we are doing to improve productivity and wealth creation is almost blinding. It's so spectacular.
So, Michael, I want to ask one thing is the artificial intelligence, the AI. Do you think will AI and automation further widen the inequality while keeping the consumer goods cheaper?
Well, you talk about income inequality as if it's a negative. I don't. So, yes, I wouldn't doubt the effect of successful capitalism is to expand income inequality. But I see that as a good thing, because that's only happening because the middle and lower classes are elevating their standard of living.
I
So,
understand, but let me ask, uh, due to this AI, the fear that they will replace jobs, Amazon just laid off people, United States Postal Service laying off peoples. Once again, those layoffs don't hurt the top 1%. They hurt the middle class because they are the normal daily workers who go every day to feed their families, and this AI boom and all these advancements, it's going to take away jobs from them, you
what
know?
you say is absolutely true, but I would argue that the net job creation will probably stay the same and may even improve. What what it does cause is dislocation. The guys who were making buggy whips when the automobile came along lost their jobs. But new people building carburetors and chassis for automobiles found new jobs that didn't exist. Now, that doesn't help the buggy whip guy. He's still at a loss. And although I think social programs are generally a cancer, this is a social program that I would heartily endorse to make the transition, the lifestyle change required by that, as easy as possible. That, I think, is a proper role of government, and it should subsidize it. But Sid, every major change from the internet to uh, the Luddites, they call them, because that was a group in Great Britain who didn't want them using new machineries for spinning yarn. They on the same exact argument that those who argue against the advances and benefits of AI. They used it back then, and the reality is, with each new wave of production, increased and better production, came newer and better jobs. Look, in the United States, 150 years ago, 80% of a man's work week went to producing food. Now it's 1 or 2%. In the United States, 50 years ago or 60 years ago, maybe, and these numbers aren't accurate, but they're ballpark right. 60%, 70% of employment in the US was manufacturing. 30 or 40% was services. Now we have like 20% manufacturing and 70% services. The nature of work will change. It will continue to change. But we can't be fearful of moving ahead. And the history of it, and who knows, maybe this time it will be different. But the history of it is that we always create more jobs than we lost. Look, when the Industrial Revolution came along in the United States, everyone was fearful of the same thing. However, we probably had 150 million people in the United States then. There's 350 million people here today, and there's many, many more jobs. So obviously the Industrial Revolution did not stop people from being employed. I don't think AI will either.
Very interesting. This is a topic I can talk about and kind of debate as well. Maybe definitely next time. Uh, and I want to mention to people that your book, Gin Rummy, A Predator's Guide, is still available. And anyone who is interested can email Michael directly at mikesal@yahoo.com. And it has also been put in the description. Michael, for people who don't know what this book is about, Gin Rummy, A Predator's Guide, would you take a couple of minutes just to explain what this book is about so they can purchase it?
It's a book written for people who already play gin. It's not for beginners and want to develop their game into a more sophisticated level. I sell it for $200 and I've gotten great reception. My theory was the only people who would want to understand gin at the level I explain it would be people who gamble, and for them, $200 would be a modest expense. Uh, but I've done great with it. I've met unbelievable people because of it, and but it's not for someone who wants to just beginning and learn. And you have to understand at least the basics of the game before this would help you at all.
Perfect. And I know you're in the midst of writing another book, the launch for which we will invite you on another podcast to talk about it. I know you're very passionate about it. We had conversations off camera. Well, Michael, this was, as always, very intellectual and entertaining. And want to thank you so much for taking the time to be on the podcast. And if there is any message you would like to leave for our audience, any closing statement, please take it away.
Well, capitalism works. That's all. Remember that. It's true. Don't get jealous. We don't want, it's nice for you people to talk about the expanding income gap. But isn't that just an appeal to our less noble human natures, jealousy, envy? We don't want to expand that on a practical sense. That income gap is serving everyone.
Perfect. Michael, thank you so much. I want to wish you and your family a happy new year and
Same to
looking
you.
forward to
Merry
having you on.
Christmas. And I'll talk to you soon. Thank you, Sid.
Thank you, sir. You take care. Bye bye. Bye bye.
Bye.